I am back from vacation once again to rank some more cases. I've been looking over the list while I was gone, watching some of my footage for the earlier cases that I ranked, and I gotta say, it's pretty funny how I just said it doesn't feel right having these two cases next to each other, when that's where I put them originally, is next to each other, just a tier lower, and I completely forgot that I did that. It's just like so funny that it seems wrong to me now, and that was my original ranking for them in general. So that definitely made me feel a lot more confident about rearranging these cases to be there. But we're moving on today. Speaking of Danganronpa, we're going to be ranking we're going to be starting today with ranking Danganronpa 2. If I can find it. Where is it? There it is. So the introduction of Danganronpa 2 has a more intricately complicated, it's not super complicated, but I do think that the setup of this case and this game is more intricate than that of the first game. Even though I don't think that the atmosphere is as tense, I don't think that the atmosphere is as like unmatched as the first game, but that's okay because this game sort of goes for an atmosphere and a sort of feeling of its own. With the whole island thing, things don't feel nearly as tense. Tensions aren't running nearly as high throughout the course of this game. Even at the beginning of the game, you don't see nearly as much distrust amongst the members of the cast that you see in the first game. Perhaps some of that can be attributed towards it being an island paradise and it just being a less stressful place to be in general, but I think that it could also potentially be attributed toward the fact that Byakuya, or Fat Byakuya, or Ultimate Imposter Byakuya, or whatever you want to call him, is very quick to bring everyone together. The game definitely gives you the immediate impression that it is doing something very different. Even though like the sort of setup of the killing game is very similar. Whoa, whoops, what the heck just happened? That it's going to be a very different experience from Danganronpa 1. It moves away from a lot of what Danganronpa 1 was in terms of feel and aesthetic, and I think that that's a good thing. It really makes this game stand out. Each Danganronpa is a very unique experience. They don't feel like each other at all. You could argue that a lot of the Ace Attorney games feel the same. They use the same sprites, a lot of the same characters, and even some of the same music. Not all of it, of course. Each game does have its sort of own musical feel to it. I think that Trials and Tribulations does a great job of standing out in the music department, but this game just gives a completely different vibe from Danganronpa 1. And even though I don't think it's like as memorable, or as, not necessarily memorable, I think it's just as memorable, but I don't think it's as appropriate for the context, I do really like what this game sets up here and what it does, because it does a really interesting job of breaking up the tension in between chapters, in between events. The music overall is just so much more chill in this game. It's kind of easy to forget the circumstances sometimes, and that leads to some of the deaths and more crazy events in this game hitting even harder when they seem to come out of the blue all of a sudden. Even though in the back of your mind it's sort of beginning to creak that something's about to happen, you know what I'm saying? And I'm talking a lot about what this game sets up, or what this case sets up for the game rather, but it's also important to note how this case, or how this chapter sets up its case. I feel like this chapter is the longest that, I could be wrong about this, but for me personally, it feels like this chapter takes the longest to get to the murder out of any of the three Danganronpa games' first chapter. There's a lot that's done here. Byakuya getting the group together, Fuyuhiko clearly just going out and doing his own thing at the beginning, Nagito being kind of a chill dude for the majority of the first half of this case. And I definitely got the feeling that this is a group that would take a lot more to break in terms of getting them to murder than the first game. Monokuma really had his work cut out for him. And you could see that, honestly, it was real difficult for him to do it, because the only reason that a murder ended up happening is because Nagito was being Nagito, and Teru had to kill someone to prevent Nagito from killing someone, because Teru wanted to kill Nagito because of what Nagito was gonna murder someone else. It's honestly pretty interesting. This is a strong cast. I feel like the cast that this game sets you up with is a much stronger cast overall than Danganronpa 1. I didn't like the investigation music as much in this game as I did in Danganronpa 1, but it grew on me. Like, you can feel when you're going into the beach house or the outhouse or whatever they call it for that party, you can feel that something's about to happen. You can feel how everything was set up. Nagito drawing sticks for getting picked for cleaning duty. Fuyuhiko running off on his own. And then you have like earlier events like Kazuichi freaking out and whatnot. It took Danganronpa 1 chapter, and like before it got into chapter 2, to establish some of the characters' personalities and what they're going to be doing within the killing game. Like, it wasn't until chapter 2 of the first game that you really began to see like Byakuya and Toko begin to go off and do their things on their own. It wasn't until chapter 2 where Kyoko really started to become like a standout character. I feel like this game, a lot of the characters started to have moments earlier on. Kazuichi, Fuyuhiko, Nagito, of course. There's a lot of character setup, a lot of story beats, and like just a lot of in general moving parts that you get to see in this first case. I don't think this case had nearly as many moving parts when it came to the rest of the cast, which is honestly why it was so difficult for me to pinpoint a killer. I was also at a loss as to who did it in this case for a somewhat different reason, but we'll get to that in a minute. The setup of the actual murder is great. Everything leading up to the blackout itself, all very intense stuff. Byakuya, or Fat Byakuya, Imposter Byakuya, Fat Yakuya, whatever, dying immediately. That was not something I expected, especially after he was like talking to Hajime in the kitchen about like his past, and it looked like it was setting him up to figure out more about this arc that Byakuya seemed to have between the first game and the second game, and then it just killed him. Baller move. And the way that they capitalize on this later in the game, where you figure out that he was an imposter and not the real Byakuya, I think is a really good storytelling that subverts expectations while also making the most of setups that you feel like were wasted by the death of a character that actually turned out to lead to some real significant, cool, interesting stuff in the plot once you get to like the second half of the game and whatnot. And I gotta say, as much as it hurt to like lose Byakuya, I wasn't feeling despair like I was when Sayaka died, which led to this being a real fun case to jump into and investigate. I remember how my mind was working on theories, trying to piece together where everyone was, which was very difficult because of how many characters were alive and involved. I think it was Mahiru who like drew up the map of the area, and that map had me going crazy, man. I don't even remember who I thought did it at first. All I remember is that I was very distinctly wrong. I think this is where I began to start first understanding what red herrings were. So I didn't think it was Peko just because she wasn't in the room. I didn't possibly piece together that it could be Teru yet. I wasn't that big brain. And I don't think that I thought it was Nagito either. I don't know what I was thinking, but I was thinking a lot of things, and I don't know if any of them were correct. Which just goes to show, or not maybe necessarily goes to show, but this case was just a lot of fun to think about. Investigating with Nagito, there was all kinds of weird crap going on, like the irons and like Chiaki investigating under the building once you got to the outside, and you're like, dang, why is that relevant? And then you go to Byakuya's cottage and you see the threatening note that was sent to him, and it's like, oh, the mystery deepens. Who could have possibly done that, you know? Definitely a more fun to investigate case than this. Definitely a more fun trial to do in this. Under the table, never forget. I thought it was a lot of fun. I thought that this case had a great number of twists and turns. Nekamaru had some very funny lines.
If she locked herself in the bathroom for that long, there's no doubt it's shit.
When you got into the end of the trial, the Nagito had multiple twists, which were all very well done, figuring out he was the killer, or that he wanted to be the killer, and that he was actually this crazy despair, hope, weirdo guy who ended up adding so much to the game overall, as a whole, in the long run. But then you figure out that he didn't actually do it, and you keep investigating and eventually find out it was the Pillsbury Doughboy. Like, I'm skimming over a lot of these details, but this was a very fun case to unravel in the trial, bit by bit. The fire door thing, very interesting, figuring out how people could have moved about in the blackout, who was where, and the whole thing of him going under the building is just all very interesting. Finding the murder weapon in the meat on bone was another very interesting final twist and climax part of the case. I had a lot of fun, a lot of setup to this case, which I feel like is appropriate given the nature of this game's cast. Very fun case to investigate, very fun trial to play, and set up a lot of repercussions for the rest of the game. You do actually come back and check out that Fat Byakuya stuff later once you figure out he is an imposter and you have a different perspective to look on his words that he said to Hajime in the kitchen from. Nagito, obviously, figuring out the kind of person he really is. Big consequences for the rest of the game. And the killer, I mean, Teru, no one likes this man. He kind of had to go first when you think about it. I wasn't really thinking about the fact that there's no way the writers would let a character like this stick around for longer than the first chapter. I guess if I would have been able to figure this out way easier, but I did not. Pretty extreme execution. Didn't feel bad for the guy, gotta say. I thought he was, like, somewhat funny for what he was. I don't know. Character was kind of trash, man. I'm not gonna lie. I'm kind of glad he was the first killer. I even like Leon better than him, and Leon killed freaking Sayaka. But this is a very exciting case to play, and for a first case, I feel like it has a lot of really good twists and turns. Generally speaking, I don't think there's anything bad I have to say about this case. You could say that the amount of time that it takes to get to the murder is too much. I personally don't think so. I think that amount of build-up is warranted for the nature of, like, the setting up this game and for how big the cast is. There's also a lot of longer-term mysteries established here, like the whole Jabberwock Island thing. What kind of organization could have possibly done this to us? So the amount of time it takes to, like, get to the meat of the case, no pun intended, bone meat to on bone meat, is not a detriment to me. And the only other thing is, like, maybe you could say that this being a Teru chapter brings it down, him being the murderer because he's not really a great character. I don't know. I think he's utilized well. The motivation to kill Nagito before he kills someone else is very relatable, and you really buy that he would kill for that reason, especially given that he does have family that he really cares about back home. Didn't really tug at my heartstrings personally, but the motivations were solid, the reasoning was solid, and it all worked. You know, it just works. So it's gonna be somewhere in either A+ or S, because this is just good, solid Danganronpa fun. I love playing this case. I love watching people play this case. It's nothing like absolutely mind-blowing to put it up in here, but it's a real solid case that I feel doesn't really have any flaws. I'm gonna put this case right above the Edgeworth 2 introductory case, because this case gets me more excited to play through the game after playing it. Gets a better start to the game than this case is. I praise this case a lot for, like, the amount of crazy things that it does in the first chapter. This case is also way shorter than this chapter, so you could say that it does a lot more in a shorter span of time than this chapter does. But this chapter is just so fun to play through, man. It's just like a great setup to the rest of the game. Don't think it's as good as this chapter, potentially because it doesn't get me, like, emotionally invested, but this was a lot of fun. Every time, like, I start going through Danganronpa 2 again, it's just like a great way to start off the game. Really makes me excited for the journey ahead. Just fun to play through, period. Love it. Love this case. But unfortunately, the next case is this case. This case saw a significant dip in quality from this case. Don't get me wrong, going into the murder with seeing all the girls in swimsuits was very nice. And it's a shame that we didn't use those assets anymore throughout the game, but I guess I can understand. So to summarize, the important takeaway from leading up to the murder in this case, besides the fact that Kazuichi is trying to peep on Sonya in a swimsuit, which was totally worth it, by the way, because her skin suit is not only pretty, but also it was super effing funny to hear Kazuichi react to it. Sonya, best Danganronpa 2 girl, by the way. I feel like I should say that right here and now. But one of the most important things in this chapter leading up to the murder, well, actually, let me take a step back. There's a few important things. This is the first time that everyone's walking around knowing what Nagito is and like the sorts of crazy stuff he tries to do. And because he wasn't the killer in this case, having a wild card like that just walking around is crazy. I felt like that was so interesting. And like Kazuichi and I think Nekomaru it was, taking the time to like tie him up, it's just funny. It's just interesting. And then you have to go feed him and you get to talk to him one-on-one for the first time since the trial of the first case. That was interesting. Character relationships start to form in this chapter. Akane and Nekomaru start to have their sort of student-teacher bond begin to formulate here. Mahiru has her little bonding time with Hiyoko. Man's nut, if you know, you know. So seeing the characters begin to form connections like that is very nice. We also get a lot more of Fuyuhiko in this chapter. Fuyuhiko is pretty absent from the first chapter, and it both feels like that and is like that literally, because he's literally not in the party at all. Or not at the party, not in the party. I don't know what you consider. Whatever. He's not at the party in the first chapter. So, again, it's a chapter with a lot of setup, mostly in terms of character relationships. And that's all good stuff. This being the beach episode is all good stuff. You also get to see some more breadcrumbs that lead up to like the final climax when you basically see Hope's Peak Academy there on the island. That's kind of like a crazy bomb for the overarching plot of the game. But I think there's a lot less interesting stuff that happens during the build up to the murder. It's basically just establishing relationships for events that happen later on. The most noteworthy thing about this case prior to the murder is the girls in swimsuits, which is crazy to say. I guess you could say like talking to tied up Nagito for the first time. Every single time you talk to Nagito and you figure out more about like his perspectives and his viewpoints and his thoughts on hope and despair is so interesting. And that's something you get throughout the whole game, and it just makes every chapter better, having moments where you talk to Nagito like that. But even so, again, you just get the first inklings of it here. The best thing is just girls in swimsuits. What could I say? And speaking of girls in swimsuits, this case has... Okay, you know what? We'll save that for when we get to the trial part. It just seemed like a good segue. We'll save the swimsuit for when we're talking about the trial. So anyway, not the most exciting chapter leading up to the murder. I didn't really care about Mahiru. The consequences on Hiyoko's psyche weren't really something I cared about either, because let's be honest, who actually likes Hiyoko? It was kind of an interesting mystery trying to figure out how someone could have gotten out of the beach house like that. I really wanted the killer to be Hiyoko, you know? But it obviously wasn't. I think that there was definitely a better way that the killer could have disguised their footprints if they just went out of the beach house to go to the ocean, wash the blood off and all that. I just feel like if they could have just put a little more thought into it, there could have been better reasoning for that behind those actions, using all the freaking water bottles from the freezer or whatever it was to wash the blood off of Peko. Spoiler alert, Peko is the killer, if you couldn't tell. But I don't know, that just seems silly. Hiyoko was kind of an obvious red herring that I really didn't want to believe was a red herring because I wanted her to be the killer. And let me tell ya, the like PS1 game, it was cool to like play, right? Because it's cool to have something like that in the game, but using that as like such an important point of the case is just, It's just, let's talk about the trial, alright? Because when you get to the trial, and Monokuma makes you figure out the mysteries of this game, and you just feel like you're getting so off topic. Like, yes, it is important to establish what Mahiru's ultimate connection is to Fuyuhiko and Fuyuhiko's sister. Yes, that is important, and I think that using that game as a means to do so is a very interesting tactic to do that. It wasn't the worst thing ever until Monokuma starts to make you figure out stuff that isn't relevant to the case. That swimsuit nonsense? Okay. The swimsuit nonsense. Agreeing when Ibuki says maybe they used gravel instead. Using the swimsuit to agree with that statement is complete and utter nonsense. There is no way. There's no way. There's no way. It's BS. I hated that moment so much. I remember like taking my mic off and just running upstairs because I was so mad trying to figure out. I like game overed multiple times at that point. It's one of those moments. This might be the most BS. This case might have like the most BS nonstop debate to figure out in Danganronpa. In fact, no, it definitely does in Danganronpa. I personally think it's even worse than 730 from this case. It's even worse than that. Debatably, even Ace Attorney 2. I don't know. This case might be able to contest with it, but that swimsuit gravel nonsense was so stupid and nonsensical, and it makes it so much worse that it wasn't even part of the actual murder you were investigating. And then when you actually do get around to investigating the actual murder, and you figure out that it was Peko, and she does the whole sparkling justice nonsense, I'm just like, oh god, why, bro? Just why? Just why? It was really obnoxious to get through, which is why I feel like they made a really good choice in making that just an act that she put on, you know? And ironically, the most interesting thing about the case happens after the trial is over, where you get to like figure out about Peko's relationship with Fuyuhiko and about how she thinks she's just a tool, and seeing what Monokuma thinks about that and how he bases his verdict off of if Peko is a human or a tool. That is the highlight of the case, and it happens after everything is over, which is of course a shame. And then Fuyuhiko kind of steals the show at the end with like his display of emotion, and that really makes you feel bad that Peko is about to die, because I didn't care about Peko leading up to that point, but seeing Fuyuhiko break down like that got me. So I felt bad for Fuyuhiko, and the ending of this case does amazing things for Fuyuhiko's character. One of the greatest character arcs in Danganronpa, potentially throughout all of these cases that we rank. The changes that Fuyuhiko goes through are absolutely phenomenal, and those can all be attributed to this case. But like I said, none of that happens until the very end. The whole video game being such a main part of the case where you get away from the actual investigation wasn't that great. Not that much leading up to the case. Nagito was good. Loved the swimsuit scene with Kazuichi and Chiaki and Sonya. And it wasn't the worst case to like investigate when you're actually investigating the actual case in the beach house. That was enjoyable. It wasn't nearly as fun as investigating this was, but that part was still fun. And it's such a shame that you have to focus on this past quote-unquote fictional video game murder throughout so much of the case. And then like the sparkling justice nonsense. I don't effing know, man. Basically, the only reason I want to rank this case higher than like C+ is because playing Danganronpa 2 is fun. That's really it. But honestly, it is more of like a C tier case. The execution, I also felt makes no sense. That's like another point against it. Monokuma was controlling her somehow. Maybe it's because they're in a simulation. Spoiler alert, by the way. But, like, how? I'm gonna put it between the two Layton cases. I feel like this was a more fun trial to go through. The freaking swimsuit nonsense just made this an absolute slog. And it's not even that either. Just figuring out the girl A, girl B, girl D, whatever nonsense. It technically is important, but you don't feel like it is. You feel like you're wasting time. It's a slog. It's meh. There's some good things in the same sense that this case has some good things, like brainwash Dispella, but All in all, it's meh. And honestly, I could even define it as only having a few redeeming qualities, but I don't necessarily think there's more bad than good. Maybe there is, but I'm gonna put it here in C. Definitely did not, unfortunately, live up to the standard Danganronpa 1 set with its second trials. And maybe that's because Danganronpa 1 did a lot of character introductions. Like, everyone was technically introduced in the first chapter, but like how Byakuya, Toko, Kyoko really began to start being characters in this chapter. This game did a lot of that in chapter 1. So this chapter had to focus more on character relationships and setting them up and whatnot. Because like, even the Mahiru Hiyoko one doesn't get any payoff until the next chapter, which I guess we should talk about now. Although I guess I can say, one thing I did forget is that this is like the only case where the body discovery announcement happens without you there, and I think that is very interesting. Just a nice little detail. I was considering putting it behind both latent cases, but I feel like putting it above this one is a good spot, because this case has a few good things. More than a few, I guess. There's some interesting stuff done here. It's meh. But now we're actually gonna talk about 2-3. The first time that I really felt despair in Danganronpa 2, because Mikan, why? Okay, we're gonna talk about Mikan a lot when I'm done talking about this case, because my goodness, did the writers do Mikan so dirty. And a lot of that ties into Danganronpa 3, the anime Danganronpa 3. And I'm gonna talk more about that when we get done with Danganronpa 2 as a whole, because when the heck else am I ever gonna talk about that? And that does affect my rankings of some of these cases in hindsight, and that's mainly owing to some of the repercussions of this last case. Where is it? This one. But obviously I'm not gonna take anything from the actual anime into consideration for the overarching rankings of the cases or the game. I just want to reiterate how dirty they do Mikan, because it's bad. It's not a bad case, okay? This case, spoiler alert, way better than this case. But my god, they hate Mikan. Holy, I feel so bad for her. I feel so bad for her. So I actually had to think about this one for a little bit and actually like look up a walkthrough of this chapter to refamiliarize myself with some of the things that happened in this case, because I don't remember a lot happening leading up to the murder in this case, but that's just fake news. A lot happens in this chapter. First of all, you get to see the payoff of Hiyoko's built-up relationship with Mahiru in this chapter. You get to see Hiyoko actually start to have human emotions, which is wild. Absolutely crazy. Furthermore, you get to see Fuyuhiko tie into this, because he is also going through a lot because of Pekko's death, and you start to see him literally come up and apologize for everyone, and he slits his stomach Yakuza style, and you're like, holy crap. Fuyuhiko gets so much focus this chapter. That was such a big event, and then you going and visiting him in the hospital later in the chapter is also very interesting. A lot of things happen in leading up in this chapter. You also have like Ibuki's concert, which let me just say, I'm glad Ibuki died. I have no shame in admitting that. But that funnels like directly into Monokuma blasting Nekomaru and having him just take it off and not show up until the very, very end of the chapter. Just another crazy event. Lots of crazy stuff be happening. Characters are changing. Characters are nearly dying. Ibuki's causing my ears to nearly die. Lots of crazy stuff happening. And then you get to the despair disease nonsense. And now I feel kind of bad by saying that it makes no sense that Monokuma was able to control Pekko in her execution, because this despair disease nonsense makes absolute zero sense. And I don't know why I love it so much. It was so interesting seeing all the different things that it could do. Hearing Akane cry, and you're like, oh, is it because of Nekomaru? And then you're like, no, it's because of the despair disease. And you're like, what the F is that, Monokuma? What kind of bioengineering bullcrap are you? Whatever. How Nagito is like always lying. Ibuki becomes gullible. When you see this, your mind starts racing again. All of a sudden, character attributes are thrown out the window. They're all over the place. Anyone could do anything. Motivations aren't what they should normally be right now. Crazy crap's gonna happen. And sure enough, crazy crap happens. You wake up with Mikan like twice? That's crazy in and of itself. I am sorry, Miss Sonia. And also the like quarantine setup that they have going on just makes for a very interesting murder plot setup. The most interesting in the game so far, easily. Seeing it turn on, and you remember the like tech functions that you were told about before, about how it only reaches within like a certain radius, and you start to see someone walk up to that noose and you begin to freak out, or at least I did. So you rush over there. There's like this sense of urgency that I haven't felt so far in this game. It's interesting that it sort of parallels Danganronpa 1-3 a little, in the sense that 1-3, you're chasing Robo Justice all over the place, and this game, you're running all over the place because you had to be at a distance because of the communication. You run over there, and you're like, glue? Why is the door glued shut? And then you bust that crap open like it's freaking hot in here. Why is it so hot in here? Just a lot of random stuff just hitting you all at once. And then you see Ibuki dead, and you're like, thank God it's not Mika. So then you're like, okay, I gotta go get the boys. So then you go get the boys, and you come back, and Hyoko's dead, and you're like, thank God it's not Mikan again. Low-key, these were the two worst characters in the cast. And Danganronpa seems to have a good habit of killing off some of its worst characters in Chapter 3, something we will see again later. And I remember this investigation so clearly because this was the first time that I was pretty sure of who it was the more I investigated, and it was a very unnerving feeling because I really didn't want it to be Mikan. And the more I investigated, the more I realized it's Mikan, isn't it? It felt really bad the more you played it, and the more you slowly began to realize it was Mikan. You would think that the ultimate nurse would know how to treat patients without getting infected herself, but I guess not. Oh my goodness. All I can think about when we get to the trial is thinking about how hard it was to accuse Mikan when she was crying and saying she wasn't the killer. It just broke my heart to do that. But then she puts the despair eyes on, and you immediately know it's her. This is the easiest case to figure out in Danganronpa 2. It's the only one that I got right, but I don't think it's like a letdown like this case is. As a Mikan lover, this case did a really great job of giving me an increasing feeling of dread the more I played it, leading up to that moment where you realize that she is the killer. And I guess I'm glossing over the details of the actual case a little. I think that covering Hyoko's body in a paper pillar and then tearing it down after Hajime leaves, I think that is like really, really cool to make it look like she killed Hyoko in between when Hajime left and returned. But when Mikan was talking about how it's too hot to figure out the time of death with the bodies, that was like an immediate tip off that it was her, because not only should the ultimate nurse be able to figure out a way to diagnose the cause of death despite the temperature, I don't know what to tell you. If like ultimate baseball star Leon could throw a crystal ball pin perfectly through a freaking set of iron bars, hit a target from 30 feet away, the ultimate nurse should be able to discern a time of death that happened in a somewhat hot room. Like, come on. But also, who else in the cast would even know to do that? Like, who else would even know to turn the temperature up to disguise the time of death by making the room hot? So it was easy to figure out very quickly that it was Mikan, and that just made the revolution all the worse when it turns out that she was basically Junko. She was Junko's slut, I guess. It's, oh my god. She talks about her beloved, and looking at how she mentions despair, it's very immediately obvious that she's talking about Junko. And then she gets executed. Yes, her execution is lame, one of the worst in the series, that's the general consensus, but her death still really hits hard, not only because I liked her, but I think that it is so tragic that she died with the remembering disease. She didn't even really get a chance to die as herself. And I'm just gonna fast forward to the end of the game just for a little to like put this point in retrospect. When you figure out that everyone in this cast was a remnant of despair, and you figure out that they were all despair-induced people, you look back on all the deaths that had happened in this game so far, like all the deaths in the simulation, you can at least take comfort in the fact that when they all died, they died as their true original selves. That was not the case for Mikan. Mikan got reverted back to a remnant of despair in her final moments, and to me, that just seems so tragic and makes her death hit even harder than it normally would have. Would it be too much to put it in phenomenal and near flawless? Because thinking back to how I felt in this case, how this was the first time Danganronpa 2 really emotionally got to me, that coupled with the fact that the investigation, or leading up to the investigation with Hajime running back and forth, was a real emotional roller coaster, and then seeing Kyoko show up there and you're like, what? How did that effing happen? And then investigating it and you slowly put the pieces together while this feeling of dread is welling up inside of you because you slowly realize more and more that it was Mikan. This is the beginning of Fuyuhiko's change as a character. The Nekomaru stuff, I don't know actually. Is the Nekomaru stuff really that good? It sets it up for a pretty good payoff in the next chapter, but it sort of just takes him out of the action for this chapter entirely. I don't know if I really like that. I still think it's a phenomenal case. It made me feel all kinds of things. I cried, I was excited, I was invested, I even laughed. I remember the freaking Monokuma Theater, the literal Monokuma Theater, where he shows this movie, and I guess Mikan took inspiration from that movie to make it look like the murders happened. I don't know, I felt like that part of the case was kind of weak. And I guess even though you're feeling of this feeling of dread build up that it was Mikan, the murder itself, aside from disguising Hyoko's death, wasn't really anything special. I don't know, it kinda is. Disguising the place and time of death, Mikan did a lot here. Taking advantage of the transceiver, I do think that it is kind of weak for Hyoko to just be in the wrong place at the wrong time and have Mikan kill her immediately as a result. I feel like because Hyoko was just such an absolute bitch to Mikan, when Mikan reverts to her despair self because of the despair disease, I think it would have made sense for her to maybe even go out of her way to go find Hyoko and kill her or something like that. I don't know. I don't know how the writers think that despair works in Mikan's head. I have seen the Danganronpa 3 anime, and that doesn't look like despair to me, if you know what I'm saying. Ibuki trying to bring everyone together for her concert prior to her death is also kind of a better event than I give it credit for, just because I don't like Ibuki, I don't like her music, but you read between the lines and you realize that she's doing that to try to piece things together between Fuyuhiko and Hyoko, which I guess is an attempt by the writers to make Hyoko's death hit a little harder, but you all know I didn't care about her. I didn't care about Ibuki or Hyoko, but I shouldn't dock the case just because the victims weren't characters that I cared about, you know? I think it could go anywhere in here, like anywhere from S to A, depending on how you feel. I really liked this case. This case has stuck with me, like, it's in the top half of DR2, and DR2 has a couple bangers towards the end, so that's saying something. I really think it deserves to be up here. When I think about just how much fun I have playing through this case, just how enjoyable this case is, it really feels near flawless. Even if the Hyoko stuff didn't hit, should I dock it for that? Because the Hyoko stuff didn't hit. They removed Nekomaru for the entire case. Should I dock it for that? I don't like Ibuki, and there was a lot of Ibuki in this chapter. I don't know, man. Kane was also pretty annoying once she started crying. I don't know. I want to put it right here. This is where I want to put it. You could even convince me to put it here. But another part of me is like, there's more wrong with this case than like most of these cases. I don't know. I talked about how the murder victim in this case was one of the least noteworthy of the entire Ace Attorney series. So should I really put this case like down here just because I didn't care about the victims nearly as much? These victims are way more noteworthy than the bank dude from this case. Like, come on. This case had a lot of good setup, like on the level of this case. It didn't have as much setup as this case because this was the beginning of the game, but even leading up to the murder felt like it had acts. in this case. Like the act of Fuyuhiko apologizing, Ibuki recognizing that, and like having her concert, and the Nekomaru thing happening, and then the despair disease. There's a lot going on here. It also felt really good having a proper investigation after the video game nonsense in this chapter. So I feel like this case is placed really well. Definitely the best third case in Danganronpa. I've kind of settled on putting it in the top half of S. I'm just debating on if I want to put it above or below Danganronpa 1-2, because the amount of setup and the amount of payoff, I think, are very comparable, and I just really like both of them. This had a much better case to investigate, but I was way more invested in Mikan than I was in even Chihiro. You know what? For the first time, Danganronpa 2 made me feel despair. I'm gonna put it here. I'm gonna put it above this. I will think about this placement, and I may adjust it a little later down the list. Speaking of which, I think we're gonna do a couple small adjustments right now. I think that this case isn't quite on the level of the rest of these. Do I want to say that with confidence? I think I do. I think I'm gonna bump this down to an amazing and very enjoyable case. And I do want to bump this one up to real solid overall. I lied to you. I'm not doing that. We're just bumping this one down to A+. I really want to, though. Maybe it's just because of Cammy Meal, but I do think, like, when I think about it, this is like a good, fairly decent case. I keep wanting to bump it up there, though. Like, I keep wanting to do that. I'm really gonna think about this one. This might deserve to be lower. This is the highest spot I could put this. So we're gonna put a pin in that. And we're gonna go on to Danganronpa 2-4, the Funhouse case, and boy was it fun. I don't know what the general consensus on this case is. I don't know if people think this case is good or if it's bad. This had one of the most unique setups for any case in the franchise. You know what? Let's just take everyone to a brand new setting. And also, you can't eat until someone dies. That's effed up. Like, that's a real crazy way to get things going. At the end of this chapter, Nekomaru comes back as a robot. Wild. So that just happens, and then you're thrown in this fun house. Emphasis on the word fun. And we immediately get put into like murder setup territory because the boys and the girls are split up. The only way to go between the two is this weird elevator. You don't know how the funhouse works. There's this center area that makes it look like it's this area that connects Strawberry and Grape House. And when they're setting all this stuff up, they slide in this little detail that the nicest rooms are soundproof, and that's just like a make or break detail about the case. I didn't notice it, and I thought that that was like ingenious because they like told us that, didn't think anything of it, and it came back in a big way later down the case. Everyone remembers this case as the case that they spammed hanging out with Fuyuhiko with, because this is the first time in the game that you can social link with Fuyuhiko. And man, that's kind of a tragedy because this setting wasn't it for it. You know, with everyone starving to death, it's just time to hear about Fuyuhiko's life story. I think that everyone hung out with Fuyuhiko in this case. Because if you're like me and you really like Sonia, for example, you probably hung out with her to the max already. I know I did. Fortunately, speaking of, I did get Mikan to max before I finished this case, so that's wonderful. Rest in peace. But in a lot of ways, this is like indirectly a Fuyuhiko chapter because everyone hangs out with him all throughout this case. Everyone does it. That's just how it is. And he is involved so little in the actual murder and whatnot. There's this like subplot going on here where no one trusts Hajime and they think that he's from the Future Foundation. Just creates a little discourse and have Monokuma really begin to not let you conserve your energy by making Monokuma Tai Chi a part of everyone's daily routine. But for the most part, this is a real slow burn chapter where everyone just starts to get more and more hungry until something happens. And I feel like they portrayed that really well, because with the music changing to be more and more sad the longer you spend here, and your movement speed changing, you almost feel some of Hajime's depression and like his physical state of being and just how bad shape he's in begin to seep through the game into you. I feel like They used every asset of the game they could to really make you feel how bad the characters are feeling the longer this chapter goes on, with the exception of, again, hanging out with Fuyuhiko this whole time. I don't really know how appropriate that was. I don't know how they would have fixed that, because I feel like not being able to hang out with Fuyuhiko until now was the correct move when you look at his character. But a lot of this case is just slow burn, just waiting for people's hunger to accumulate, which is done well, but I do wish there was more. There is a little more in the sense that this case has the help room. I forget what exactly they call it, but it's the room with the zero escape game in it that Nagito plays, and plays Russian roulette with only one bullet in the gun, and basically is handed the script on the plot, which is very interesting, but we're gonna get to Nagito here in a moment. Let's talk about the murder first. I did not see Nekomaru's murder coming at all, because they just reintroduced him to the game. He was not there for the majority of the events of the last chapter, and he just got all these cool new robot sprites, and you'd think that it would be cool to see him like actually interact with anyone and be around, especially since most of this chapter takes place in this secluded funhouse area where you feel like the characters don't really get to shine like they usually do. A lot of people are just waiting. Everyone's like having tense moments with Hajime because they suspect him of being a member of the Future Foundation. But in a lot of ways, Nekomaru's death almost feels like kind of a waste, but not in a real bad way. You feel sad that he's gone, you know? And investigating this case is interesting because this funhouse is all kinds of effed up. You figure out so much about the layout of this darn funhouse, a lot of which you can't even figure out until like the trial starts, you know? Easily the highlight of this case is going over to Nagito and playing as Nagito, which is so interesting. I don't think anyone would try telling you that the Nagito portion of this investigation isn't probably the highlight of this entire case. Getting to play as Nagito, seeing some of his internal thoughts while you play, aside from the fact that he does the escape room, and it's the only thing like that in any of these games. I don't recall doing like something like that anywhere else. Maybe I did it somewhere in Ace Attorney, but I don't think so. It's really interesting, real challenging, real unique, and I feel like that last step where you have to figure out the sequence of beeping dots in correlation to the like black and white circles was really difficult to figure out. I think that like I couldn't figure it out my first playthrough. I had to ask Monami for help. And then I took forever before I revisited the game, came back again, and I did figure it out. Maybe there were some traces in my memory left that like helped me, but I don't think Nagito even explained how to figure it out. Like, I didn't even know. I don't even remember the details out of 11. I don't know. I just remember that last part of that escape room being a real challenge, and I was stuck there forever. Everyone who I've seen play through this case got stuck there forever. And of course, Nagito is rewarded with all this information that is teased to the player because we don't get to see any of it, and it cuts back to Hajime. Speaking of the help room, Hajime does have this really nice little scene with Chiaki where he thinks of going in there that's referenced again in the following chapter, and I just think that it's a really nice little chapter for Hajime and Chiaki, or not a nice chapter, like a nice little event for Hajime and Chiaki. Because if you watch the Danganronpa 3 anime, Hajime and Chiaki, their interactions are kind of a big deal. And I feel like that little event, just seeing that sort of personal interaction, connection between the two, is, despite how short it is and how seemingly inconsequential it is at the time, until you get to this case, is just a really good, memorable moment that I really liked. But then you get to the trial. The majority of the trial is figuring out how the heck the freaking funhouse works, which could be a good or a bad thing, depending on how much you enjoyed that specifically. I personally didn't mind it. I thought it was fun. Some people think that the funhouse's layout is very easy to figure out, and going through the motions in the trial is not fun. I didn't get it when I first played through the game, so it was actually very fun for me to like go through the trial, and figuring out how this funhouse worked kind of blew my mind a little bit, not gonna lie. Maybe I'm just dumb. Nagito's attitude throughout the trial is very interesting because this is also when Nagito begins to realize what was going on with the cast being remnants of despair, and that's not something you even realize until you get to the final chapter of the game. You don't really realize what was making Nagito have this sudden change in personality and attitude. Maybe not personality, his personality was still the same, but his attitude towards the cast changed so drastically, and it really makes your mind work and begin to wonder why, and that feeds into the next chapter very well as well. So I think that that was a great way to have like progressive storytelling carry over from this chapter into the next one. I thought that was great. It would have been so easy for them to make the stuff that Nagito found in that file an integral part of the case, or like a payoff for finishing the case. It's something that you figure out at the end of the chapter, but they didn't, and they used that as a means to like make this chapter even more impactful, and that's honestly something that I feel adds more to this chapter because it keeps your mind thinking and wondering about what was in that file. Why is Nagito acting like this, you know? So Nagito is great in this trial. I personally liked investigating the funhouse as much as I did, and I think that the twist that they used to finally make you realize it was Gundam, like I said when I first started talking about the beginnings of this case, is very well implemented. Wasn't something I saw. I don't know what the general consensus is on people who read mystery novels and whatnot on a very small detail being mentioned like once very early on in the plot and then becoming a big deal in figuring out who the killer was or figuring out the mystery later down the line. But I really liked it here. I really liked how Gundam hearing the clock when he should not have been able to is used to get him. I like it. And on the other hand, you might think that the whole reason that that was like a problem in general is because Fuyuhiko just happened to be in the lounge. If Fuyuhiko was not in the lounge, this would have practically been an unsolvable case, and Gundam would have had a perfect murder. So I guess thankfully Fuyuhiko was just in the lounge, like convenience at its finest, you know? Speaking of Gundam, you really start to see like the foundlings of Gundam's and Sonya's little relationship, which drives Kazuichi crazy, kind of drives me a little crazy too. But if they wanted that to be like a super impactful thing, I do feel like they dropped the ball a little on that. They introduced that a little too late. That would have been better if they had set it up significantly earlier, at least in my opinion, personally. Can we talk about how like Nekomaru kind of just agreed to this fight to the death? It was badass, but I don't know, felt a little forced, and Gundam winning the fight because he sent his hamsters to attack his off switch was, I don't know, man. Sounds kind of crazy. It is pretty crazy. So looking back on the case overall, it has a lot of really good little moments. Love the Hajime Chiaki moment. You're probably gonna hang out with Fuyuhiko a lot in this case, which doesn't feel like correct in terms of tone, but it's technically optional, so that's okay. Investigating as Nagito and doing the escape game are probably the highlight of the case. This case tries to like stick to one thing throughout, how it gradually builds up the hunger plot leading up to the murder, and then throughout the investigation most of it is focused on how the funhouse works. So one progressive continuation, and you know it's going to reach a breaking point because you can't just all die of starvation. The mystery of the funhouse is, for the most part, the entire mystery of Mechamaru's death. So I don't think it has as much layers as this case is. It's definitely inferior to this case, but it also feels more complete and proper than this case for sure. I think that it is very difficult to figure out the killer, and the victim also comes as a surprise as well. So I think I'm gonna put it at the top of overall real solid. It has better moments than either of these cases. You could put it behind this case, depending on how you're feeling. I think that the main deciding factor as to whether it goes above or below this case is how many points do you want to give this case for investigating as Nagito? How cool, how memorable was that? It is like the only escape room in Danganronpa history. It's also the only time that you switch to control over a character that isn't the protagonist, outside of like Danganronpa V3's ending, where you briefly play as Himiko and you briefly play as Maki. But no, you sit down in this case and you properly play as Nagito. And I think that even though you may consider this case to just have more enjoyability overall, that Nagito moment, it's not even really a moment. You spend a good deal of chunk as Nagito. You do a solid part of the investigation as him, and you do the escape room. I don't know though, now that I'm thinking about it, should I give the escape room that much props just because it's something different and something unique? I kinda want to. I also think that Nagito's attitude throughout the trial is just so continually interesting throughout all of it that it deserves to be placed above this case. I think the most interesting thing about this case was Viola and how Viola acts throughout the case. The comparison here is Viola more interesting in this case than Nagito is in this case? I think the answer is no. So I'm real happy with this placement, putting it at the top of A tier. It's real solid overall, does what it does well. The hunger stuff works. I enjoyed investigating the funhouse, and both the victim and the killer came as a surprise. Even though I didn't really emotionally care for either of them like I did for Mikan, it was a real solid experience. Definitely goes right there, maybe right here, but top of A tier. Danganronpa 2.5 is what many consider to be the peak of the entirety of Danganronpa, and it's not difficult to see why. Everything that's been happening up to this point conglomerates into this case. It all reaches a climax. Nagito has been this ticking time bomb all game. You know, it's just been waiting for like the moment where he causes some huge problem. And after what he learned in this case, this is that moment. Monokuma doesn't even have to do anything, because Nagito does so much crazy crap by himself. He creates this bomb scare, and you immediately get really worried. Everything leading up to the murder in this chapter feels really short, because Nagito keeps the pace like crazy. This man, a problem, it's finally time we have to address it. Nagito instigates some very big problems, basically blows up Kajuichi, who lives somehow, and the rest of the chapter is basically trying to track him down and figuring out, at least leading up to the murder of course, is trying to track him down, figure out what's going on with the dang bombs. You even investigate Monomi's house, which should be more interesting than it ended up being, but I gotta say, I wasn't even sure who was going to die, because I really didn't think it was going to be Nagito, because not only does he have ultimate luck bullshit, but also I thought it was gonna be like sort of a mirror of this case, where there's a murder and everyone thinks that it's Nagito, and then again that it turns out that it just isn't, just like in this case, because potentially ultimate luck, but I was expecting it to be on a much more grander scale. But nope, none of that happens. Nagito got freaking obliterated, and you begin to wonder, who could have done this savagery right here? Suicide just doesn't even seem like a possibility. And after we discovered his body and like began the investigation, I began to get Mikan levels of dread again, because Sonya was right there. She was right there in the Air Force Base, and I'm like, no, Sonya did it. Sonya did it. And you know what? Sonya's not a very important character, so I don't think she would, like, looking back on it, it isn't realistic to think that she would be a killer at the climax of the game like this, but I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about how important Sonya was to me, and how they were going to throw me into despair again, because that's what Danganronpa loves to do. And it seemed like so perfect. Like, she was right there in the Air Force Base. It was just a matter of how exactly she did it, how exactly she made it happen, and I was worried about that all investigation. And this investigation takes us to some pretty interesting places. This is when we look into the file that Nagito had. We don't get to see everything that it was that he saw, but we actually reach all the way back to the Byakuya mystery in this chapter. I think that it's very interesting that they chose this chapter as the place to do that. But everyone knows the highlight of this right here is the trial. It's how absolutely crazy it is, how you slowly unravel the facts that this was Nagito's plan, the different layers of it, and how masterfully the writers utilize luck in a way that feels really well done. It doesn't feel like BS because of how it was established, how Nagito's luck works in universe, in this game. And you really begin to think, how far ahead can Nagito plan? How much exactly did he rely on luck? You have to utilize these internal gut feelings almost instead of logic as a means to figure out how to solve this case, because the facts of the matter wouldn't necessarily point to anyone specifically. You have to think like Nagito and what he would want to happen, because that's just how his luck works. And that's interesting. And every layer you peel back from this case in the trial just makes it all like seem even crazier overall. And you're like, what? Nagito was really like stabbing himself in the leg like that while holding on to the spear? Like, holy crap, man. This is some savage crap. And then you think about, okay, well, he committed suicide, but maybe he didn't. And then you realize what he did with the poison and how he put the poison in the bottles. And you realize that he wanted to weed out the traitor this way. And you realize his luck would have then resulted in the traitor throwing the poison. I don't know. This case is mind-blowing. This case is so great. The investigation theme, side note, also amazing. The traitor stuff, my god, does Nagito really want to figure out who this traitor is? The lengths this man goes to, man, why did Monokuma have to use the word traitor in the first place? That wasn't even accurate when you think about it. I would not have described Chiaki as a traitor, but because that was the term that was used all game, I wonder how different this case or even this whole game would have been if they just called Chiaki something else. You know, like not a traitor, if there was like someone who just wasn't a member of your class or something, just something less menacing than the word traitor. When they talked about Sakura like that, it actually like made sense, you know, because she was feeding information to Monokuma, and if this case didn't happen, she was supposed to be the first one to actually like make a kill. Chiaki was considered this traitor, and like the layers of that even go deeper than you'd think, because everyone turned out to be a remnant of despair, and how like being a good guy actually turned out to be the traitor. And this was something that Nagito realized, and you realized at the end of this case he actually wanted the traitor to come out alive and for them to not figure it out. And you realize that was the extent of Nagito's ability to plan ahead and utilize his own luck into things. But even that might not be the case when you look at the game overall and you realize that eventually everyone did get out alive and get undespaired. And we'll talk about that a little more when we talk about the next case. But this case, it gives you so much to think about. Figuring it out is so much fun. The whole case is a roller coaster, start to finish. This case wastes no time in building up the plot and establishing things. Like, this chapter starts immediately with Nagito setting up the events that lead to the murder and whatnot, and it doesn't let up all the way through. The stakes just get more tense and more crazy. Nagito starts blowing stuff up, threatening to blow even more stuff up. You gotta ask Monami for help, but Monami can't help because of course she can't help. And then Nagito gets murdered, and like, holy crap, I didn't even remember. Do you remember that scene where like you were slowly beginning to almost discover Nagito's body? That music that's playing like when you open that warehouse or whatever it was that he's in, that was such an ominous atmosphere. I don't know if it's as ominous as Mikan climbing that stepladder to the noose, because that crap was scary, but it felt like a Sephiroth level boss or something. I don't know, like the vibes that created were crazy, and the payoff did not disappoint. Seeing how brutalized he was doing that investigation, I was scared it was Sonya. I was really scared it was Sonya, really glad it was not. But that trial really had me guessing about all kinds of crap. Nagito's plan had so many layers to it, and each one was so fun to pull back. And then you eventually put together what it was he wanted and what his objective here was, and then you factor in his luck and realize who it was that threw the poisoned bottle. And you look back on Chiaki's actions throughout the chapter, and it just suddenly makes sense. And you see her smile at you, and you just feel this pit in your heart. it just feels exactly what the developers wanted it to feel like. I gotta say, that's gotta be it. You feel really bad because who in their right mind would dislike Chiaki? Everyone wants this character to live. This character's probably most people's waifus. This character's practically waifu bait. It doesn't even let up there. Then Monokuma goes after Monami, and you feel like all hell is breaking loose. The end of this chapter did something I did not think possible, which was make me feel bad for Monami. I never thought that Monami was secretly in league with Monokuma or a malicious entity or anything like that, but I also never really cared for her. She was kind of just a joke. It was a shame that Chisayuki Zome was only in the DR3 anime because I would have loved her in this game. She's the best girl in all of Danganronpa, but going back to Monami, when she's about to get executed and she gives her little speech about how if you can learn to love yourself, that will support you the rest of your life. I have never forgotten that line. What a great line. I can't believe Monami left me with a feeling like that. And then she takes Chiaki's hand and waves to us, and you just feel this crushing emptiness. This is the Danganronpa experience. I feel like this case is what makes most people feel like how I felt in this case. Beat for beat, just how crazy the murder was, how tense everything was leading up to it. Oh, wild investigation, although I actually ironically think this investigation is better, but this trial is way better. And then it's sort of like reversed because you feel really bad for like the killer in 2-5 and you feel really bad for the victim in 1-1, or at least I did. And then it also sprinkles that extra bit at the end with Makoto talking to Kyoko about how he's psychic, and then it fades to black, but then you have Monami's speech in this game, and that hit home a lot stronger than I thought it would. Chiaki's execution is also one of the few that makes you feel for a moment like there is actually hope to escape, but there ain't ever any hope in Danganronpa before chapter 6's, bro. There just ain't. So this is an unparalleled masterpiece, and for everyone who thought I put this chapter too high, I know there's probably tons of you out there who thought I put this chapter too high. You'll be happy to know I am gonna put this chapter above this chapter. This chapter is just so important to me personally. This is like one of my personal, most invested moments almost ever in a video game is this chapter. But this, oh my god, the way they utilize Nagito's luck, how it's basically one story start to finish. It starts immediately when the chapter starts, does not let up until the very end. Nagito's crazy ass doing all kinds of nonsensical stuff, blowing stuff up, the crap with the traitor going crazy, the menacing aura like before you find his body, an investigation that made me feel like my waifu was going to be the killer again, and then the absolute craziest thrill ride of a trial so far in Danganronpa, with twists and turns that had you guessing every step of the way, figuring out who the killer was and why, and it just being devastating and just leading up to this despair-filled climax where you feel really bad about Chiaki. Monami leaves you with these somber words. It's an unparalleled masterpiece, start to finish. If I had to say like anything at all bad about this case, it would probably be that the investigation of his murder wasn't the most exciting, I guess. And I feel like if I didn't think that it was Sonya, I may have ranked it a little lower, or maybe not. I don't know how like important that really is in the long run. It's important to me because that's why I was so invested in the investigation segment of the case, is because Sonya was there at the military base, I did really think it was her. But for me, because I did, and it's no use talking about what ifs anyway, because it all culminated together to be the ultimate Danganronpa experience so far, and in a lot of ways is a climactic version of this case, which was another unparalleled masterpiece, and the reason that I got into Danganronpa and case solving in general. This felt like an evolved form of this, and that's why it's higher. I still think the best of Trials and Tribulations is better though. This case lasted longer, and the investigation was also just so engaging, and I feel like the main reason this investigation was engaging is because I felt like it was Sonya. They're both great, like they're both at the top of the list, don't get me wrong, but for now, I don't know if I'd put anything in V3 above this case. But for the time being, I do think that Ace Attorney's best trumps Danganronpa's best, even though if you could tell like how many Danganronpa cases I'm putting in the upper echelon of the list, I do think I prefer Danganronpa as a series overall to Ace Attorney. I can probably say that now, but I can probably say this will probably be, it's not the highest case on the list. I will actually say that. There is a sneaky case that I snuck in here that is higher than this, but I do think that while I like Danganronpa as a franchise overall, Ace Attorney has the higher peak. This case is peak. But we were talking about this case is also peak. It's its own kind of peak, man. This case is phenomenal, unparalleled masterpiece, you know what I'm saying? But let's hurry up and rank the end of Danganronpa 2 because my throat is absolutely killing me and I need a break. But there is a lot to talk about here, so let's see if I can go over the main points. This case begins with this interesting ship segment with Nagito talking to some unidentified individual, which is immediately interesting because Nagito just died despite the fact that he was by far the most interesting and engaging person in the game. So having a flashback scene with Nagito in it might be the best way that they could have started this chapter in general, aside from the fact that that scene is supposed to be this big setup for what goes down with Hajime throughout this case. And then you figure out that things are immediately wrong because you see dead people begin to show up at the meeting spot, and no one seems to be reacting to this at all. So you, the player, recognize something is very wrong, and this is when you begin to get the first real inklings that you're in a simulation. You could figure it out with some of the things that happened in the earlier chapters, but they are very few and far between. The most you really have to go off on this assumption before this chapter is basically Byakuya talking at the very beginning of the game about how Jabberwock Island shouldn't be deserted like this, and seeing Monokuma do all kinds of crazy things that he really shouldn't be able to do, like summon a bunch of Autobots in chapter 1, or the Despair Disease, or controlling Pekko. Like, Monokuma does a lot of stuff that he shouldn't be able to. You try to write it off as just wacky Danganronpa-ness. Kind of like how in the first game, he could just show up wherever he wanted, and you're not really supposed to think about how he gets in there when you're solving murders. You're like, oh, maybe they use the entrance that Monokuma uses when he gets in a room or something. You're not really supposed to think about that stuff, and for that reason, it's why I don't really consider those kinds of things real hints throughout most of the game. So there's really no real reason for you to have a strong assumption that you're in a simulation, aside from maybe some specific world building elements set up at the beginning of the game. But now you realize with how much crazy stuff is going on and just what is going on with the game and with the characters, you start to begin to notice that there's some sus crap going on. But that's just the beginning, because you very quickly go into Hope's Peak Academy and it's just like nostalgia overload because you're back in the same sort of situation you were in the first game. I think that's the point where you notice just how drastically different the atmosphere is in this game compared to the first game. It feels almost like you're stepping into a different world with just how drastically different going into Hope's Peak Academy feels with these characters that we've only seen on this like island paradise up till now. So it's just such a drastic shift in tone, which really demonstrates just how different of an experience Danganronpa 2 is compared to 1. Going back to how I was talking about how different their vibes were when I was talking about this case. So I can say that throughout the course of this investigation, the way that the game gives you the information to give you the big info dump during the trial, I feel is way better done here than in this case. I like this investigation way more. The way that they make it more and more simulation-esque as you go is cool. The way that they give you like breadcrumbs, the way that they talk about how, I remember this one line from Monokuma so vividly, how Junko Enoshima has the ability to change people's values. And that was such a powerful line. And then you watch the DR3 anime and you see that in action and you see how she treats Mikan and how Mikan acts in response, and you're just like, wow, Junko Enoshima is...
Junko Enoshima is... Cause Junko Enoshima is... Junko Enoshima is... Junko Enoshima is... Junko Enoshima is what?
She's her. That's the best way to describe it. Alter Ego makes an appearance, technically, which is real cool. I never felt super strongly about Alter Ego, but seeing Alter Ego here is really cool to give Hajime some information. But let's talk about this trial, because this is a massive trial. You gotta figure out that you're in a simulation, which happens like very quickly, because the game practically tells you that as you're investigating. So it's a good thing that when you get to the trial, the characters very quickly get on the same page. I think the characters were acting like idiots throughout the first half of this trial, and then the second half was exposition dump, which is why this one is just a meh case despite it being the climax of the game. I really like how quickly the characters all get on page with the fact that it is a simulation so that we can get to the juicy stuff about the remnants of despair. Makoto showing up is so cool and so hype. I'm so glad they decided to do that for this case. I think that it aesthetically pairs very well as well, because the investigation of this case brought you back to the setting of the first game. So having characters from the first game show up in the trial is very thematic. Also, their selection of them is very great. As much as I love Aoi Asahina, I feel that her showing up in this chapter might have actually been a detriment to it, given the sort of things that go on throughout it and the things that the characters, the realizations that they have to come to and the things that they figure out. I feel like it being Makoto Kyoko Byakuya was a good decision. So the twist that the whole cast of this game were the remnants of despair, and this game doesn't get into the fact that they were brainwashed to do it from real Chiaki's death, so we can't really use that to this case's benefit to say that that's how they set it up. All we get from this case is that they were the remnants of despair. This case does not explain how, which I think really works for it, because then we don't have to really worry about the fact that they were brainwashed. Basically, having the characters think about how they could have possibly turned into such people as that is what really makes the sort of psychological warfare that AI Junko is doing here really work as well as it does. I'm not sure if AI Junko was the best way that they could have done this. I almost feel like once you get the reveal that Hajime is secretly Izuru Kamakura, and we go through all that nonsense, which we'll talk a little more about in a moment, that I almost wanted to see Izuru awaken within Hajime and have him be the final villain. So I think it just being AI Junko is kind of a letdown. I almost wanted the computer simulation to like wake up Izuru and you have to fight him whilst in Hajime's head, because Hajime does have this moment where he's feeling really down and depressed, and he remembers Chiaki, and he sort of has this moment in his own mind where he talks to her, gets his feet back and whatnot. And I feel like having Izuru come out to be the villain would have been a better way to be the final villain than just reusing Junko. I understand why they reused Junko, and I don't think it's necessarily bad. I almost think that AI Junko was a more menacing force than normal Junko, at least in this game. Normal Junko in Danganronpa 3 is an absolute devil. And I do think that AI Junko cranks it up a notch from the first game and really making it seem like there's a no-win situation for the characters. It's a pretty good ending. I think that the use of the old characters is really great. They show up and steal the show for a little bit, but they don't take the spotlight away from Danganronpa 2's cast when they have to overcome the fact that they were the remnants of despair and make their own decision to not lose their memories and to revert back to how they were and still find a means to overcome it. It's a several step process, and there's a lot of stuff revealed about the world in this chapter. Like, we get all the stuff about how the Future Foundation and how that's actually Makoto's group that he joined, and we learn all about Izuru Kamakura and how Hajime was actually just a normal dude the whole time. This is also when you realize why Nagito was acting so strange starting in the fourth case onward. A lot of loose ends tie up, and I feel like it all comes together a lot better than in this case, where they basically just tell you all about how this happened and what the world is like out there. I feel like the circumstances of the characters tie into how everything resolves here way better. And I feel like this situation where you just realize the world is effed, but we gotta go outside anyway, the decision these characters has to make is like just such a more difficult one and a more interesting one as well from an ending perspective. So generally speaking, I like this ending a lot more than I like this ending. I like the investigation more. I like how the investigation gives you information more. I think the twists are better. I think that the characters going to their low point before finally like rising back up again is done way better. The use of Makoto, Byakuya, Kyoko is done really well. Again, not really sure I like AI Junko as the main villain. I wish we could have gotten more of Izuru Kamakura. We get more of him in Danganronpa 3, but again, we cannot take that into consideration. Speaking of Danganronpa 3, one thing that I do want to mention is how people often say that Danganronpa 3 invalidates this whole game, because in Danganronpa 3, you see that all of these characters lived, and they all are basically show up in the real world to help out Makoto at the end of the Hope arc, I believe. But that was something that this game actually established at the very end of the game. After the characters made their decision and went back to the real world, Makoto is talking to his friends about how they decided to stay on the island and help their friends that are still plugged into the AI system. And given that Izuru Kamakura is the ultimate everything, like they talked about in this case, it is pretty heavily implied that they are able to save everyone who died in this game, with the exception of Chiaki, of course, which means that even in this game, it's basically pretty much established that no one dies, which I think is a real breath of fresh air and honestly a really nice change after how this game sort of made me feel like that was almost what could happen. I remember in the second case of Danganronpa 1, how Makoto was reminiscing about Sayaka's death. He was talking about how he was like looking at his shower and noticed how not a trace of anything remained that could have implied that Sayaka died in there. And I remember those words were highlighted yellow in the text box, like it had never happened. And that kind of made me think that this game was a simulation, but it wasn't. So Sayaka is dead. Biggest L of all time. I remember thinking that when we like saw the pictures of Mondo, Leon, Chihiro in chapter 2 or 3 or whenever it was, that was a picture of them having gotten out of the simulation and were like so happy to live life again, and whoever was running it took the picture and put it back in the simulation for like Makoto and everyone who was still in there. That was not what happened. But this obviously was a simulation, and everyone is implied to have been rescued, which if you watch DR3 is exactly what happens, but I don't think DR3 canonized that. I think that it was heavily implied to the point of basically being canon at the end of this game, which is important to clarify because a lot of people may think that that means that this ending invalidates a lot of what happened throughout the course of the game. Monokuma even makes a comment in this chapter about how this was a pointless killing game in which the remnants of despair killed themselves off, while the Future Foundation was basically forced to watch after all that they'd done to try to save them, or at least all that Makoto had done. So even though I personally liked that aspect of the ending and felt that it gave such a great contrast to this game's ending, which even though this game tried to end on a high note, it really did feel like in a lot of ways there was still a lot of despair out there. This game left me feeling a lot more hope at the end, which I think is a good thing. And I think that for me personally, looking back on the events of the game, does it really invalidate them? I don't think so, because it was the events of this game that ultimately helped these characters form their bonds again to overcome having become remnants of despair. Which again takes me back to Mikan again, because Mikan was the only one who had to die as a remnant of despair in this game, and it made me really worried about her. It made me think about how she wouldn't still be herself when she woke up, because when she died, she reverted back to being a remnant of despair. So it made me really think that if they saved Mikan, she would still be a remnant of despair. This chapter really made me think back and feel even worse about Mikan. So I was honestly gonna put this case somewhere in the middle tiers, or somewhere from C+ to A+, just like as a general idea when I started making this list. But now that I'm talking about it, maybe it does deserve to be higher up, and maybe S. I don't know. I really thought AI Junko wasn't the best direction to go in. And the fact that she was there being the active menacing force throughout the entirety of the chapter does set it back. But everything else I thought was really good. I really liked the fact that it was a simulation. I think that it one-upped this twist of the whole world basically being destroyed. How this game decided to take it a step further and say that the world isn't even real, bro. You ain't even in the real world. I like how they use the old characters. I liked Izuru Kamakura, even though I feel like he's very underutilized in this game and could have been used better in this last chapter. And I like the Remnants of Despair twist. I liked the decision that the characters had to overcome in order to beat AI Junko. Let's compare it to this ending. Is that a good idea? Do I think that this ending is better or worse than this ending? Is that a good way for me to figure out where to rank this? Because both these endings tied up so much. This ending really makes you think too. When you figure out that they're Remnants of Despair and Makoto is listing up all the effed up things that they did, and you just think about what that means. Not even when he starts to say how some people tried to have children with Junko's dead body, which is effed up in and of itself. But when you think about what exactly it means when he's explaining those things, like what Teru probably did to his mom, what Mikan probably did, even just imagining what Nagito did, because most people probably hadn't played Ultra Despair Girls when they played this game. If you did, I'm sorry. It really leaves you thinking and just leaves this uncomfortable feeling. And let me tell you, when you actually learn about some of it in Danganronpa 3, it is very uncomfortable, so this game is very rightful in the feelings that it leaves you with. I felt like Simon Kios was a better villain, but I feel like this case was more enjoyable. This was a crazy ending. This is probably the only ending on this list that is crazier than this. This is wild, the revelations that happen in this ending. And now that I'm thinking about it, why don't I want to put it in S? Is it just like not as good? That why? Because I was originally gonna put it like right here, right? But then I thought about it and I'm like, I could bump it up to about here, or maybe here. And that's mainly because it can be sometimes very difficult to compare Danganronpa cases to Ace Attorney cases, especially when you're talking about a Danganronpa ending, because let's be honest, this isn't much of a case. You don't solve much here. So when you think about that, how does this really rank? Because if I think about it in terms of story, yes, this is something that is S tier, right? But you don't do much solving. Every Danganronpa final case is very easy to do from the case solving perspective. You have all the information. It's basically just unraveling everything, and you don't have to solve much. Who the villain is it's not revealed that it's AI Junko immediately, but who the villain is revealed relatively fast, which again is another reason why it would have been better if Izuru was the villain, because Izuru wasn't revealed until a little later into the chapter. I guess you can say, because Izuru is the one who put AI Junko into this world, that he is the main villain, but he's not an acting force. Once Hajime goes into the Neo World program, we never see Izuru again, and I feel like that is a missed opportunity. We only see him in flashbacks and in the DR3 anime. Because you play as Hajime, it could even have been an opportunity to play from the despair side of things and solve mysteries and prove people wrong when they were trying to figure out ways out of things. But I don't know if that's me getting a little too far into the what ifs, you know? So I'm gonna put this here with an asterisk that says, yes, I am putting it not an S when I feel like it could very much be an S, but that's because this isn't necessarily a tier list of the best stories, it's the best cases. And because the case solving aspect of this is basically non-existent, I'm not going to bump it up here above all of these Ace Attorney cases where you actually do have to solve and figure stuff out, because I think that there is a lot to be said to that, even though I feel like I did enjoy this more than these Ace Attorney cases, even though I feel like the story is better here. The fact that the actual case solving aspect of it isn't really there is going to be a reason why I bump this down to being right here and amazing and very enjoyable. But depending on how well you think that that is a valid reason to take into consideration when ranking a case. You could also consider me to have put it up here in phenomenal and near flawless, because as an ending, I really do feel like this experience is on that level, even though in terms of a case solving game where you're solving cases, you don't get to do nearly as much of that in this case as you did throughout the entire rest of the game. And that's just the nature of how Danganronpa endings are. They just don't have the same case-solving aspect to it. It's more about unveiling the final things of the story and having the characters overcome the situation that the villain has put them in. So I am gonna put it there in amazing and very enjoyable, and that's gonna do it for Danganronpa 2. Next, we're gonna do Danganronpa V3. We're gonna finish off Danganronpa. But first, I need a break, bro. My throat is killing me. We'll get to that in maybe a few days for me, just a second for you. In the meantime, I'm just gonna stare at this case and think about if that's where it's supposed to go.
Danganronpa